Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kiorkof, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my top 12 tight end rankings for the 2023 fantasy football season. And though I'm excited to share these rankings, the tight end position is so tricky. I mean, the overall production that we have seen over the course of just the last two seasons at the tight end position has been underwhelming. We have seen just as many kickers or team defenses score more than 150 fantasy points as we have seen tight ends accomplish that feat. It is absolutely ridiculous how much of a drop-off in production we have witnessed at the tight end position. And unless you're getting one of the primary studs, you might want to just wait for the later round guys that you can get without having to spend much draft capital. I mean, when you just look at the history of the tight end position and what it suggests going into 2023, when we look at the last 5 seasons, 2018 through 2022, the history of the tight end position suggests in a half PPR scoring format that we're going to see 5 tight ends from our last season's top 12 repeat this upcoming season on an average base. Now, the primary cause for absence has often been injuries or leaving their primary team through free agency. So keep that in mind as we approach our 2023 fantasy football drafts, as I'll be sharing with you guys statistics and facts regarding these 12 players so to help you make the most informed decisions in your upcoming drafts. Before we begin, again, I want to thank you guys for supporting the channel every single day. For those of you who have not yet already, be sure to subscribe. We're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2023 season with the singular goal of trying to help you win a 2023 fantasy football championship. So whether that's daily posts and or live streams, rankings, all of that in order to help you guys. Speaking of rankings, for those of you who are trying to get your hands on my 2023 fantasy football draft rankings and draft guide, be sure to go ahead and travel down to the description of the video and click on the link traveling to Underdog Fantasy so you can go ahead and use promo code Andrew today, because when you do so, signing up with code Andrew and making a first-time deposit minimum of $10 is not only going to get you a first-time deposit match up to $100, it's also going to include my 2023 fantasy football draft guide, which is hundreds, if not thousands of hours of data and research that I've done this offseason in order to help you guys prepare for your drafts, along with my fantasy football draft rankings, which is by position, quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, and defense by tier, along with top 200 flex for both half and full PPR rankings, updated weekly throughout the month of August. So regardless of when you're drafting, it's ready to go. Those weekly updates will be sent from email from me to you personally, so make sure you check your spam folder. I will obviously update you guys as to when those have been sent, so do not worry about that. Additionally, besides getting the draft guide and the rankings for the offseason, you'll also get weekly updated rankings for weeks 1 through 18 every Sunday morning from me to you, positional, by tier, including flex rankings, half and full PPR. So help me help you this upcoming season. And go ahead and travel on over to Underdog Fantasy. Use code Andrew. Of course, get your hands on the draft guide, just giving you a little bit of a preview as to what it looks like and what you can get your hands on today. If you're wondering whether or not you're eligible based on your current location, you can go ahead and use the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility. So gain an advantage on your league mates. Use code Andrew today. Thank you very much. And of course, draft responsibly. All right, let's get into talking about our top 12 tight end rankings going into the season, beginning with our number 1. What a surprise. It's Travis Kelce. Travis Kelce has been the number 1 ranked tight end in a half PPR scoring format for 6 out of the last 7 seasons. Now, going into the 2022 season, many of us were wondering how much of an uptick Travis Kelce was going to see due to the absence of Tyreek Hill no longer being a part of the team. Now, when you take his statistics in terms of targets, receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns, and put it on the all-time list of tight end performances, this is what we found from Travis Kelce's 2022 efforts. He was 5th all-time in targets for a tight end in a single season, 2nd all-time in terms of receptions in a single season, 4th all-time in terms of receiving yards, and 8th all-time in terms of receiving touchdowns. An incredible season, to say the very least, for Travis Kelce, and there's a reason why he is absolutely worth the first-round selection going into our 2023 draft, because the consistency has been there, and he doesn't miss time. Travis Kelce has not missed a game due to injury in his career since 2013, his rookie season. Yes, he's going to be 34 years old, but the consistency and the opportunity has led to his overall success, and it's not slowing down. Since 2020, the Kansas City Chiefs have led all teams in the National Football League in terms of total targets to the tight end position, receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns. They're number 1 amongst all 4 categories at the tight end position since 2020. And the fun doesn't stop there. Since 2020, with Patrick Mahomes on the field, during the regular season, Travis Kelce averages 15.38 half PPR fantasy points per game in the 48 contests that they played together. Incredible overall production. And not only that, when you take into account that with Patrick Mahomes, Travis Kelce's averaging 8.98 targets per game, and then you go ahead and extrapolate some numbers in regards to Anytime Travis Kelce with Patrick Mahomes has gotten himself 8 or more targets, which we have seen 33 of his last 48 regular season games, which is nearly 70% of the time, he's averaging 17.8 half PPR fantasy points per game. This is a tight end that since 2020 has had more games of 100 or more receiving yards than he has games of less than 50 receiving yards. Travis Kelce is one of one. He has gotten himself 10 plus receiving touchdowns in 4 out of the last 5 seasons. He has garnered over 130 targets in each of the last 5 seasons. And once again, we have target vacancies within this offense. No Juju Smith-Schuster and no Mecole Hardman. That leads to Travis Kelce, of course, once again, maintaining the top standing at the tight end position. Let's move on to Mark Andrews, our number 2. The only player over the course of the last 7 years that has dethroned Travis Kelce for being the number 1 overall ranked tight end within a season. Mark Andrews has the potential to once again, be a number 1 overall tight end, but it's going to be a matter of whether or not, Lamar Jackson can stay healthy and whether this offense evolves going from Greg Roman as our former offensive coordinator now to Todd Monken. Now, in terms of consistency, Mark Andrews has always been in this top conversation. In fact, in the last 4 seasons, he has always been a top 6 tight end in terms of end of season production. Since 2020, Mark Andrews has averaged about 12.8 half PPR fantasy points per game in the 31 contests that he has played. But obviously, we have seen some of those contests with Tyler Huntley at quarterback and others with Lamar Jackson. When Lamar Jackson has been under center, who hopefully will be able to maintain his health this upcoming season, Mark Andrews averaged 12.5 fantasy points per game in the 20 contests that they've played together, while he had a little bit of an uptick with Tyler Huntley, averaging 13.36 in the 11 games that they played together. So regardless of who's playing at the quarterback position, even if Lamar is to potentially get injured, hopefully that's not going to happen. I'd love to see another healthy season for Lamar because we know what the upside is there. But regardless of who's under center for the Baltimore Ravens this upcoming season, Mark Andrews is in good hands. And even though he was relatively inconsistent in his weekly production last year, he was dealing with injuries, and that obviously is going to play a factor on the overall production of a tight end. Now, since 2019, since Lamar Jackson has been the starting quarterback of this team, the Baltimore Ravens have targeted their tight ends the second most times amongst all teams in the National Football League. Throughout that span of time, of course, Mark Andrews has been a touchdown machine, as we have seen the Baltimore Ravens tight ends get the 3rd most receiving touchdowns since 2019. So then the question remains, is the offensive coordinator shift from Greg Roman to Todd Monken going to make a huge difference? The last time Todd Monken was the offensive coordinator of a team in which they passed the ball a pretty efficient amount of times was back in 2018, when he was the offensive coordinator of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. In that season, they targeted their tight ends the 14th most times, which was 105 total times within the season. That led to 71 receptions, 902 receiving yards, and 11 receiving touchdowns. Overall, pretty good stats from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers tight ends back in 2018. But this is an offense that has their primary number 1 receiving option as Mark Andrews. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers back in 2018 had their Mike Evans. So there wasn't really the primary receiving threat. So I do expect the numbers to be far more skewed in the direction of heavy tight end production, especially considering the fact that last season Mark Andrews was targeted on 26.9% of the routes that he ran. I'm expecting a lot of production from him. We know he's a red zone threat. He's the number 1 receiving option of a Baltimore offense that hopefully will be throwing the ball far more this year. Moving on to our number 3, we have TJ Hockenson. He's probably the tight end that I'm most excited about this coming season because what he was able to accomplish with the Minnesota Vikings was the new standard. And without Adam Thielen within that offense, without Irv Smith Jr., without Dalvin Cook, we have 199 vacant targets available for receiving options. And I understand they brought in Addison as a rookie wide receiver that they drafted, but TJ Hockenson should be seeing himself a lot of targets. Last season, in 2022, he set career highs in targets, receptions, and receiving yards. And when we go ahead and just look at what he produced with the Detroit Lions last season prior to being traded, weeks 1 through 8, he was averaging 10.36 fantasy points per game. Throughout that 7-game span, he was the number 4 overall tight end in fantasy points per game on average. As soon as he joined the Minnesota Vikings, from weeks 9 through 18, he was averaging 9.99 fantasy points per game. Sure, it was a little bit of a downtick, but you got to remember there was a game last season as a member of the Detroit Lions where they took on the Seattle Seahawks, and I think TJ Hockenson had 30, 40 points, and that was definitely giving him a little bit of an extra boost in terms of his fantasy point per game average throughout that span of time. But when he was a member of the Minnesota Vikings last season, he was targeted on 23.76% of the routes that he ran. It's a really high number, especially for the tight end position. Based on the statistics that I've collected, a pretty efficient tight end is going to be targeted on 18% of the routes that they run. 24% nearly is a really strong number. And last season, as a member of the Minnesota Vikings, in 8 of his 11 games, he was targeted 8 or more times. In those contests, averaging 12.2 fantasy points per game, which is a 72% rate of success in terms of getting that level of opportunity within the offense that certainly wanted to shift the game to throwing the ball to the tight end position. Again, you got to remember, Kevin O'Connell used to be the offensive coordinator of the LA Rams. They utilized a lot of 11 personnel situations with Tyler Higbee and got Tyler Higbee to be a valuable tight end in seasons past. So there's a reason why the Minnesota Vikings targeted their tight ends the 3rd most times amongst all teams last season and are probably going to continue to do so, like I mentioned, with the target vacancy of no more Adam Thielen, Dalvin Cook, or Irv Smith Jr. within this offense. The final thing I wanted to mention in regards to TJ Hockenson revolves around his potential for this upcoming season. I have him at number 3 because when we go ahead and look at the games in which TJ Hockenson participated for the Minnesota Vikings, and we include the playoff game, and take his averages in terms of targets, receptions, receiving yards, receiving touchdowns, fantasy points, his 2023 potential is about 150 targets, 108 receptions, 1,001 receiving yards, 5 receiving touchdowns, and 182 fantasy points, making him a perfect tight end 3 at the end of the season. That's why I have him at this position. Moving on, let's talk about George Kittle, the thumbnail for today's episode. George Kittle has been a top 4 tight end in 4 out of the last 5 seasons. The only season in which he wasn't capable of being a top 5 tight end obviously missed a lot of time due to injury. And in fact, there have been other seasons where he's missed 3 or 4 games. And if it wasn't for those injuries to take place to George Kittle, this guy would always be a top 2 or 3 tight end. That's just been the guarantee alongside what George Kittle has been able to present. Now, in the last 2 seasons, George Kittle has averaged about 11.48 half PPR fantasy points per game in the 28 regular season games he has participated in. Now, even though that average doesn't seem like a world beater, a number where we're super excited about the potential of George Kittle, amongst the rest of the tight end position, that is a fantastic number to average, especially considering when he takes on the NFC West in his career. So against the teams within his own division, the Arizona Cardinals, the Seattle Seahawks, and the Los Angeles Rams, he always dominates. So that means that there's 6 games in his schedule that he is putting up incredible numbers. In the last 2 seasons, in the 10 contests against the NFC West, he's averaging 15.26 half PPR fantasy points per game. Now, as we approach the 2023 season, the primary question regarding the 49ers offense has always been who's starting at quarterback. And it looks like to me that Brock Purdy should be the starting quarterback, and that bodes very well for George Kittle, because last season, when Brock Purdy took over, Brock Purdy helped George Kittle in the last 6 regular season games attain a 14.25 fantasy point per game average. Throughout that span of time, he was the number 1 tight end in fantasy points per game and total fantasy points contributed, and he was just dominating. The presence of Brock Purdy is what led to George Kittle finally breaking away from 4 to 5 receiving touchdowns in a year, as he set a career high in receiving touchdowns purely based on the efforts of Brock Purdy getting the ball down in the red zone. Because typically George Kittle is not a tight end that is going to see a lot of opportunity. You look at the last 2 seasons for the San Francisco 49ers, they have targeted their tight end the 25th most times in the National Football League. That is in the bottom third of teams. That is not a number that you typically would, kind of assume the San Francisco 49ers are getting their tight ends involved with, considering how much we hear about George Kittle and how much he's able to produce. I mean, really, throughout the last 2 years, anytime George Kittle has been given enough opportunity to get himself 4 or more receptions in a game, the guy's averaging over 14 fantasy points per game. I think the lack of opportunity certainly does play a factor with so many mouths to feed within that offense with McCaffrey, Debo, Ayuk. Even that being the case, George Kittle has still managed to be a fantastic option last season with Brock Purdy in the offense, getting targeted about 21% of the routes that he ran. Yes, he's not running as many routes as other, overall tight ends, considering he's such a good blocker, but still a fantastic option. And like we've always said, George Kittle plays well with backup quarterbacks. So even if something is to happen at the position, it doesn't really matter who's throwing the ball. Kittle's going to find himself success. Let's move on to our number 5. We have Darren Waller. Darren Waller in each of the last 2 seasons has obviously dealt with injuries, but if you go back to 2019 and 2020, he was a top 3 tight end in both of those years. In both those years, getting himself 90 or more receptions, which many of us remember, he was the number 1 receiving option of that Las Vegas Raiders offense. And he was doing a fantastic job at that. So when given opportunity, we know that Darren Waller can deliver. It's just a matter of can he stay healthy. I mean, looking at the last 3 seasons, 2020 through 2022, Darren Waller's averaged about 11.69 fantasy points per game in the 34 contests that he has played. Now, when we specifically isolate moments in time in which Darren Waller has been healthy, specifically 2020, fully healthy, averaged over 14 fantasy points per game. In 2021, weeks 1 through 11 prior to his injury, averaging 10.94 fantasy points per game, was the number 5 ranked tight end throughout that span of time. Go to 2022. Weeks 15 through 18, healthy at the end of the season, averaging 9.83 fantasy points per game. And now you involve him in an offense like the New York Giants, who need a number 1 receiving option. They most desperately do, because outside of Isaiah Hodgins and or someone like Saquon Barkley, no one else is going to see a high volume of targets. Therefore, as soon as we have Darren Waller in the mix, he's not only a red zone threat, but he's also a deep ball receiving threat that can absolutely be the number 1 target within this offense. From 2019 through 2022, no other tight end in the National Football League has more targets and receptions of 20 or more yards down the field than Darren Waller. That is how he was utilized with the Raiders, because of his deadly speed and, of course, his size and strength. You get him down the seam, and, of course, he is out-bodying those safeties, and it's difficult for definitely linebackers to cover him, but at times even cornerbacks. I think he is a fantastic talent. When you check out the fact that the New York Giants has a target vacancy of 109 total targets, with Kenny Golladay, Richie James Jr., and Marcus Johnson all gone this upcoming season, I understand Brian Daboll has never explicitly funnel targeted the tight end position in his career as an offensive coordinator with the Bills and or with the New York Giants. But the current OC for the New York Giants, Mike Kafka, used to be a coach within the Kansas City Chiefs organization from 2017 through 2021. He's learned a thing or two about using the tight end position, and I think Darren Waller will certainly be able to show that this upcoming season. Moving on to our number 6, we have Dallas Goedert. Dallas Goedert last season was on pace to easily be a top 4, if not 5, overall tight end based on his production and his consistency. From weeks 1 through 10 prior to the injury that he sustained against the Washington Commanders, the guy was averaging 10.21 fantasy points per game and was the number 4 overall ranked tight end throughout that span of time. If you go ahead and take his pace of play and extend it throughout all 17 games, would have put up 162.5 fantasy points, would have been the number 4 overall tight end. And that really isn't a surprise. I mean, even with the fact that the Eagles took a huge step forward, we had seen Dallas Goedert be a consistent top 12 fantasy tight end in the last couple seasons. In fact, has accomplished that in 3 out of the last 4 seasons. In some of those years, even had Zach Ertz in the lineup, which was certainly taking away a lot of the value and opportunity on a weekly basis away from him. But either way, like I mentioned, this offense took a step forward last season. It led to Dallas Goedert setting career highs in targets, receptions, receiving yards, and even in catch rate. His catch rate last season was 79.71, catching nearly 80% of the targets sent in his direction. Even though he's not a tight end that is getting a boatload of targets due to the fact that Devonta Smith and, of course, A.J. Brown coexist within this offense, the fact that he's able to catch nearly 80% of the targets in his direction will lead to his fantasy points. Because this team last season targeted their tight ends the 26th most times amongst all teams in the league. Again, that's a bottom third number, similar to the way that, the San Francisco 49ers utilize their tight ends. But even with that being the case, the efficiency of Dallas Goedert is what gets him the fantasy points. Anytime in the last 2 years, even including the playoffs in which he's had 5 or more targets, he's averaging over 11 fantasy points per game. Now, in terms of getting those levels of opportunities, 5+ targets, he's been able to do that in 21 of the last 30 games he's played, which is a 70% success rate. Pretty good overall numbers. This is a tight end that's not going to come off the field. He's going to play 90+% of the offensive snaps. He's accomplished that in 18 of the last 25 games he has played without Zach Ertz in the lineup. And even though I'd love to rank him a little bit higher, the biggest issue with Dallas Goedert is red zone potential. Last season, amongst all teams in the National Football League, the only other team that threw the ball less in the red zone than the Philadelphia Eagles were the Chicago Bears. The Philadelphia Eagles threw the ball in the red zone 31% of the time and ran the ball 69% of the time. If you want to see Dallas Goedert be a consistent option, he's going to have to find more opportunities in the red zone, because I don't think the target counts on a per week basis average are going to increase anywhere to the number that we want them to, considering how many other receiving threats there are coexisting within this offense. Yet, he's still my number 6. All right, before we move on to the second half of this conversation, I do want to remind you guys, if you guys have not yet already, do me a solid, go down to the description of the video, travel on over to Underdog Fantasy. Now, the primary reason is to go ahead and, of course, draft via Underdog to gain experience prior to your home leagues drafting. The more experience you have, the better you'll be in a position to succeed on draft day. Now, another way to help you succeed on draft day is by when you sign up using code Andrew and make that first time deposit minimum of $10, I will be sending you my 2023 fantasy football draft guide and rankings. Those rankings will be updated every week throughout the entire month of August so that regardless of when you're drafting, you're ready to go. Rankings at all primary positions, quarterback, running back, tight end, wide receiver, kicker, and defense, including half PPR, full PPR rankings on top of top 200 flex, so that when you're drafting, you're in the best position to succeed, because that's the entire point. We want to help you win a 2023 fantasy football championship this season. And I truly mean that. I mean, I say the whole season because the rankings don't stop throughout the preseason. Every single Sunday morning, I'll be sending you rankings with half and full PPR at all positions by tier so that you are setting yourself up to go ahead, win on Sundays, and capture a championship. So use code Andrew, make that first time deposit, and get drafting. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into the second half of this conversation with Kyle Pitts as our number 7. Kyle Pitts last season obviously had a season-ending injury. Even prior to the season-ending injury, this is one of the more inconsistent players of 2022 and certainly has left a bad taste in many of our mouths. Just think about the concept of Kyle Pitts, one of the highest drafted tight ends in NFL history. You know, obviously had an incredible rookie season where he was number 1. He set the record for the most fantasy points a rookie tight end has ever scored in fantasy football history. 6'6", ran a 4.4 40. This is an elite level talent. But the offense, Arthur Smith really didn't help accentuate his skills in 2022. And I think there could be a chance where he can get back on the right track in 2023, because we saw them get him a boatload of targets and opportunities when Matt Ryan was the quarterback back in 2021. It's just a matter of whether or not the quarterback play currently between Desmond Ridder and Taylor Heineke can get Kyle Pitts to that level. Because last season, in the 9 games in which Kyle Pitts was healthy, he only averaged 6.2 fantasy points per game. And of course, that had to do with the fact that Marcus Mariota wasn't the greatest passing quarterback. But even in those opportunities, Kyle Pitts had himself a pretty good target percentage. He was targeted 28% of the routes that he ran last season. That is an extremely high number in comparison to a lot of other tight ends. So the opportunities were there. And don't get me wrong, opportunities are great and all, and they're really a great indicator as to potential success for the future. But if the opportunities are inaccurate, what's the point of them? And that's the case with Marcus Mariota last season. I mean, anytime Kyle Pitts has been able to get the ball in his hands 4 or more times with 4 or more receptions in each of the last 2 years, he's averaging 11.5 fantasy points per game. He's just only been able to do that in 12 of his 25 regular season games, which is 48% of the time. Get the ball in his hands. And I'm hoping Arthur Smith has woken up this offseason and realized, man, we got to get the tight end the ball, because yes, this team has utilized their tight ends in the past, and even Arthur Smith back with the Tennessee Titans with Jonnu Smith back then utilized the tight end position. Speaking of Jonnu Smith, they brought him in this offseason from the New England Patriots to, of course, be the backup tight end for this team. He is going to get himself some receptions. That is a given. But Kyle Pitts is more of a receiver than a tight end. He's not going to play in the inline. He's someone that they're going to line up in the slot or out wide, and he's going to dominate there. And hopefully, the target opportunity in vacancy from Damiere Byrd, Ferksker, Pruitt, a bunch of other receivers, 118 open available targets within this offense, probably in an offense that is going to throw the ball a little bit more than what, you know, the Marcus Mariota offenses were presenting on a weekly basis. I think there's a very good chance that we could see Kyle Pitts get back on track. Sure, he's going to need touchdowns to be able to be a top-level threat. And in an offense that wants to run the ball just as much as anybody, and especially down in the red zone, it's going to be tough for him to find the end zone, but hopefully Desmond Ridder can get him to a point to being a valuable enough prospect with just receptions and receiving yards. Moving on, let's talk about Evan Engram. Evan Engram is going to be a tricky play this year, because he did have himself one explosive performance last season that pretty much set him up for success. But before we get into the nitty-gritty, let's look at this, big picture. Last season, Evan Engram had an incredible year, setting career highs in receptions, receiving yards, and catch rate. Nearly a 75% catch rate, which is fantastic at the tight end position. Now, last year, he did average 8.26 fantasy points per game in the 17 games he played. But only in 6 of those games did he produce more than 10 fantasy points. In 9 of those games, he either produced 6 or fewer fantasy points. Obviously, far more inconsistent production than ones that would help you win in a given week. From weeks 1 through 12 of last year, he averaged 5.65 fantasy points per game. Was the number 26 overall fantasy tight end in terms of fantasy points per game throughout that span of time. But from weeks 13 through 18, my goodness, it was completely different. Averaging 12.84 fantasy points per game, and was the number 2 overall tight end in terms of fantasy points per game on average throughout that span of time. Now, the reason why that existed was because of the performance that he had against the division rival Tennessee Titans in week 14, in which Evan Engram put up 33.7 fantasy points. That is quite literally the 10th best tight end fantasy performance in a singular game going all the way back to 2002. That's the 10th best. Incredible numbers. And sure, the Jacksonville Jaguars, they utilized their tight ends a lot last year, the 10th most targets at the position amongst all teams in the league. And sure, Doug Peterson rewarded Evan Engram with a contract this offseason. Doug Peterson has had himself a tight end one associated with his offense in 6 out of the last 6 seasons that he has been a head coach in the National Football League. We know that the Jacksonville Jaguars use 11 personnel or at least one tight end in formations 97% of the time last season. We're going to get a target vacancy without a couple of the tight ends that were there, and of course Marvin Jones Jr. out, but Calvin Ridley is most likely going to fill in for that, and Calvin Ridley's probably going to dig into Evan Ingram's work, and that is why I'm expecting him to still get value, but certainly not be at the upper end of this conversation, and probably one of those guys that you might want to wait later on in your drafts before investing high draft capital in their overall production. Let's move on to David Njoku, our number 9. David Njoku last season was the guy that I planted the flag on, and I said, hey, he's going to be an absolute stud option because the Cleveland Browns, Kevin Stefanski, they want to utilize the tight end position. Jacoby Brissett, Deshaun Watson, both of them love utilizing tight ends, and that's exactly what happened. If it wasn't for the fact that, of course, David Njoku dealt with an injury last season, would have been fantastic because with Jacoby Brissett in the 9 games that they played together prior to, of course, his injury and David Njoku going down, he was the number 7 overall tight end in fantasy points per game, averaging 8.48 fantasy points per game. And in terms of his overall pace for the season, would have finished as the number 7 overall tight end, putting up 137 fantasy points, which at the current rate in which we were drafting him based on his ADP of being like tight end 14, 15 last offseason, was an incredible production boost based on the entire offense and the fact that Austin Hooper was no longer associated with the offense, having gone to the Tennessee Titans last offseason. So when we look at this offense going into 2023, the fact that the Cleveland Browns with Kevin Stefanski as their head coach / play caller, they've targeted their tight ends the 4th most times amongst all teams throughout that span of time. We have seen Deshaun Watson in seasons past utilize the tight end position a bunch with the Houston Texans organization in 2019 and in 2020. Both those seasons, the tight end position consisted of 106 targets and 100 targets, leading to 166 fantasy points and 171 fantasy points. I understand that Deshaun Watson didn't play well last season, and his 58.24% passing completion percentage, which was quite literally the 5th worst amongst all quarterbacks with 100 or more dropbacks last season. Terrible numbers, we get it, but he still utilized tight ends last season. From weeks 13 through 18, the tight end position was averaging about 8.18 fantasy points per game last season when Deshaun Watson was under center. If we get any sort of improvement, which we certainly will, going from 58% passing completion percentage, it may be literally impossible for him not to improve. This offense, and specifically David Njoku, will be an even better fantasy option going into the season. Let's move on to our number 10. We have Pat Freiermuth. Pat Freiermuth is a little bit of a tricky player. He could end up seeing less utilization with Darnell Washington coming over from Georgia, of course, being drafted this offseason. There may be a potential in which Pat Freiermuth takes a little bit of a step back, but this offense loves to utilize the tight end position. Since 2021, they've targeted their tight ends the 6th most times amongst all teams in the National Football League, and obviously Pat Freiermuth has benefited from that. In the last 2 seasons, only averaging about 7.45 fantasy points per game. As you can tell in comparison to some of these other tight ends, the drop-off is beginning to hit here by the time we get to tight end 8, 9, 10. It's a significant drop-off, and that's what I talk about in terms of waiting for some of these guys. You take the studs, fine, but otherwise wait for these other guys because they're all pretty much middle of the pack, sharing similar levels of opportunity and subsequent production. This being said, with his production in the last 2 years, it's been okay. With Kenny Pickett last season, in the full games in which Kenny Pickett was a starter, only averaged 6.86 fantasy points per game throughout that 9-game span, and was obviously significantly better with Mitchell Trubisky because he found himself in the end zone in those scenarios, and or with Ben Roethlisberger back in 2021 because we know Big Ben couldn't throw the ball more than 15 yards down the field without his arm giving out, so he'd have to dump it off to Pat Freiermuth for majority of that given season. In terms of pace of play, if we take the 9 games in which Kenny Pickett played with Pat Freiermuth last season, branch that off to 17 games, that's 105 targets, 71 receptions, and 809 receiving yards. No receiving touchdowns based on the fact that they never scored or linked up together in that regard. But this is an offense that will find themselves some sort of success in the red zone. When you compare the 2022 Pittsburgh Steelers to the 2021 Pittsburgh Steelers, the red zone production was significantly different as Kenny Pickett had a 39% passing completion percentage in the red zone, which only led to 5 passing touchdowns, while the year prior, Big Ben had a 53% passing completion percentage and 19 red zone passing touchdowns. There's a huge difference, but I know that the utilization, I know that this offensive coordinator, Matt Canada, wants to use the tight end position. They're going to use Pat Freiermuth. He's going to be of value. Obviously just not enough to where, I'm super excited about his overall utilization. I'd like to pair up someone like Pat Freiermuth with a Dalton Kincaid or a Sam Laporta and hope that they break out. Otherwise, I'll just stick with his production. Moving on to our number 11, we have Tyler Higbee. Tyler Higbee last season, 108 targets, 72 catches, 620 receiving yards, and 3 receiving touchdowns. Had a pretty decent year as the number 9 overall tight end in fantasy. A couple years before that, in 2019, where he had a huge stint of games back end of the year. I don't know if you guys remember that. He was a fantasy championship supporter and in many cases helped us win with Jared Goff there, as he had some monster performances. But in the last 2 seasons has been kind of lackluster with Matthew Stafford under center, only averaging 7.27 fantasy points per game overall in the 32 games that he played, regardless of who was under center. But with Matthew Stafford last year, there were glimpses in which, Tyler Higbee was an awesome option, a guy that in a full PPR was even more valuable. I mean, weeks 1 through 5 of last year, Higbee was averaging 9.6 targets per game and 9.1 fantasy points per game. Obviously, those numbers began to fall apart after a while, and then as soon as Matthew Stafford left the lineup, from weeks 11 through 18 without Stafford, only averaged 6.94 fantasy points per game. But from my perspective, at this current moment in time, an offense like the Los Angeles Rams that threw the ball the 12th most times last season, that targeted their tight ends the 19th most times in each of the last 2 seasons combined, I think there's a potential in which they're going to light it up through the air, because Matthew Stafford and this offense are a pass-heavy team. That's what Sean McVay is built. And I know that, yes, Cooper Kupp is going to get himself his 170, 180 targets, assuming he stays healthy. But who else is going to catch the ball? Van Jefferson? Sure. Okay, we'll give him a couple of receptions. And then it's Tyler Higbee. If anything, Tyler Higbee is the number 2 in this offense and kind of serves as like the Dalton Schultz of what we saw, the Dallas Cowboys do last season with CeeDee Lamb and Schultz. CeeDee Lamb being number 1, Schultz number 2. That's what I expect to see. And of course, the tight end position, it's definitely relying on touchdowns. I think Tyler Higbee probably finds himself in the end zone a fair amount of times. I mean, last season had himself a 24.24% target share within the red zone and a 25.6% target share within the 10-yard line. Give him opportunities. An offense that is specifically always in 11 personnel should get him some targets and some fantasy points. Moving on. The last option I wanted to mention is Chigoziem Okonkwo, the second-year tight end, 6'3", 240 pounds, ran a 4.5 240. He is a prospect. And this is a guy that since last season I've kept my eye on, because I knew if Austin Hooper was not going to stay in this Tennessee Titans offense, there was going to be potential for Ryan Tannehill to get back to throwing the ball to the tight end, because we've missed that in the last couple of years since the absence of Jonnu Smith. Now, Chigoziem Okonkwo last season, didn't play much, only played 36% of the offensive snaps, had 32 receptions, 450 receiving yards, 3 receiving touchdowns, and 81.2 fantasy points. But his biggest damage was done from weeks 13 through 18, where throughout that span of time, he was the number 11 overall tight end in terms of fantasy points per game on average throughout 6 games. Last season, he commanded a 25% target percentage, which means he got targeted 1 out of every 4 routes that he ran last season within this offense. And a lot of those games did not include Ryan Tannehill under center, who we have seen throughout his career likes to utilize the tight end position. Back in 2020, targeted the tight end position for a 29% target share, 2021, 20%, 2022, 24%. Pretty good overall numbers in my mind. And I think Chigoziem Okonkwo, especially considering this offense is going to have more receiving threats in comparison to last year, considering all the injuries. Now you have a healthy Treylon Burks and DeAndre Hopkins within the offense. 200 vacated targets in terms of guys that are now gone, that were, the primary receiving threats of last year. I see a very high level of potential for Chigoziem Okonkwo. I mean, last season amongst all tight ends with 40 or more targets, he was number 1 in terms of yards per route run with a 2.61 average, and he was number 1 amongst all tight ends in yards after the catch per reception, 7.81 yards. Again, he's a big body tight end who has the speed to make plays after the catch. The new offensive coordinator going into 2023 is Tim Kelly. Used to be the offensive coordinator for Houston from 2019 through 2021. They targeted their tight ends the 16th most times throughout that span of time. Decent numbers. I mean, in comparison to the Tennessee Titans in the last couple of years, they targeted their tight ends the 15th most times amongst all tight ends. So very similar numbers. And I'm expecting Chigoziem Okonkwo, based on the fact that Ryan Tannehill likes to utilize him. And of course, this offense is going to have opportunities for someone else besides Treylon Burks and of course, DeAndre Hopkins to catch the ball. He's my number 12. That's going to cover for me today. Thank you, everybody, for watching. If you like today's content, all the information and data and research I've collected and have presented towards you in order to give you guys the best chance of making the right decisions on draft day, be sure to go ahead, click the like button down below, and of course, subscribe. We're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2023 season. Try to help us get to 100K subscribers. Until tomorrow, I appreciate you guys. Be sure to check out the link down in the description. Sign up on Underdog using code Andrew. Make that first-time deposit so I can continue to send you rankings throughout the entire season, because the hope is we can win some fantasy championships. Until tomorrow, thank you, everybody, for watching. I'll see you guys. Peace.